The scream shattered the stillness of the Colorado night like glass breaking across stone. Lillian Cole bolted upright in her bed, clutching her quilt to her chest, convinced she'd been dreaming until the thunderous crash from the main room of her cabin confirmed her worst fears. Someone was inside her home. Colorado territory, 1876. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs as she slid from her bed, bare feet silent against the rough wooden floor. At 22, she'd been living alone on the outskirts of Montrose for nearly 6 months. Ever since her father's passing had left her with nothing but this modest cabin and the determination to make it on her own. She'd faced the skepticism of the townsfolk, the harsh winters, and the isolation, but never had she faced intruders in the dead of night. "Check the back room," a gruff voice commanded, followed by heavy footsteps moving through her small home. Lillian's hands trembled as she reached for the hunting knife her father had given her years ago. It was a poor defense against what sounded like multiple men, but it was all she had. The cabin was a mile from town, too far for her screams to bring help. "Ain't much here," another voice drawled. "Just some food and a few dollars, I reckon. The old man who lived here before was supposed to have gold," a third voice added. "Search harder." Lillian pressed her back against the wall beside her bedroom door. Her father had never owned gold. He'd been a simple rancher who'd barely made ends meet. These men were mistaken, and that mistake might cost her life. The door to her bedroom burst open, and a bearded man stood silhouetted in the dim light of the oil lamp he held. His eyes widened at the sight of her, and a slow, menacing smile spread across his face. "Well, what do we have here?" he called over his shoulder. "Boys, looks like this place ain't as empty as we thought." Lillian gripped her knife tighter, raising it before her. "Get out of my home," she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The man laughed, taking a step toward her. "Put that down, little lady, before you hurt yourself." 2 more men appeared behind him, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, but their intentions clear in the way they blocked the only exit. "Please," Lillian said, backing away. "I have nothing of value. Take what little money I have and leave." "Oh, I think you underestimate your value," the first man said, reaching for her. Lillian slashed with her knife, catching his forearm. He howled in pain and rage, lunging for her with his uninjured arm. She ducked away, but the small room left her nowhere to run. She screamed again, the sound tearing from her throat as the other 2 men moved to corner her. Outside, the pounding of hooves cut through the night air. The men froze, exchanging glances. "You said this place was isolated," the wounded man hissed. "It is," another answered, moving toward the window to peer into the darkness. A gunshot cracked the night, and the front door of the cabin splintered. The men cursed, drawing their own weapons as they rushed from the bedroom toward the commotion. Lillian seized the moment, scrambling across her bed and grabbing her father's old shotgun from beneath it. Her hands shook so badly she could barely load the shells, but the sounds of struggle from the main room spurred her on. Another gunshot. A man yelled in pain. Something heavy crashed against the wall. Clutching the loaded shotgun, Lillian crept to her bedroom door. The scene in her small living area was chaos. Her table lay overturned, and one of the intruders was sprawled motionless beside it. The other 2 were engaged in a violent struggle with a tall stranger whose face she couldn't see in the darkness. One of the outlaws broke away, turning toward her bedroom with desperation in his eyes. When he saw her with the shotgun, he raised his pistol. Lillian fired without thinking. The blast knocked her backward as the outlaw crumpled to the floor, clutching his chest. The sudden light and deafening sound momentarily stunned everyone in the room. In that frozen moment, Lillian saw her remaining attacker drive a knife toward the stranger who'd come to her aid. "Look out," she cried. The stranger twisted at the last second. The blade sliced his arm instead of his chest, and he responded with a powerful blow that sent the outlaw reeling. A final punch, and the last intruder collapsed unconscious beside his companions. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by ragged breathing and the creaking of the wooden floor. The stranger straightened, turning toward Lillian, who still held the smoking shotgun. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice deep and tinged with concern. Lillian lowered the gun slowly, her entire body trembling. No, she managed. Thank you. Who are you? He stepped closer into the light cast by the overturned oil lamp that miraculously hadn't set the cabin ablaze. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled beneath his hat and a strong jawline shadowed with stubble. His eyes, a startling blue even in the dim light, assessed her with equal parts concern and wariness. "Henry Frost," he said, tipping his hat slightly despite the circumstances. "I've got a camp about half a mile from here. Heard your scream and came running." Lillian nodded, suddenly aware that she stood in her nightgown with nothing but a thin shawl hastily wrapped around her shoulders. She clutched it tighter, acutely conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Lillian Cole," she replied. "This is my home." Henry nodded, then turned his attention to the men on her floor. One was dead, the one she'd shot. Another lay unconscious, while the third, the one she'd slashed with her knife, was moaning softly, clutching his bleeding arm. "We need to get the sheriff," Henry said, binding the wounded man's hands with a length of rope he took from his belt. "These men are wanted in 3 counties. Saw their faces on posters in town yesterday." "You're not from Montrose," Lillian said. It wasn't a question, she would have remembered seeing him. "Just passing through," he confirmed, securing the unconscious outlaw as well. "Been working my way north, looking for ranch work." Lillian set down the shotgun and moved to right the overturned table, needing to do something with her shaking hands. "Well, Mr. Frost, it seems fortunate for me that you decided to camp nearby tonight." He glanced up at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Just Henry is fine." "And yes, madam, I'd say it was fortunate for both of us. I wasn't looking forward to another night of my own cooking." Despite everything, Lillian found herself smiling back. "Once we've dealt with this situation, I'd be happy to offer you a proper meal as thanks." "That's mighty kind," Henry replied, then grew serious again. "But first, you might want to get dressed. We've got a ride into town ahead of us." Lillian nodded, backing toward her bedroom. She paused at the doorway. "Henry, thank you, truly." His eyes met hers across the room, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or something deeper that neither was ready to name. "Anyone would have done the same," he said softly. "No," Lillian replied. "They wouldn't have." She closed her bedroom door and leaned against it, her heart still racing though, whether from the attack or the gaze of the blue-eyed stranger in her living room. She couldn't quite say. The ride into Montrose was tense and silent. Henry had insisted on loading the bodies of the outlaws onto their own horses, the living ones bound securely, the dead one draped over his saddle. Lillian rode her father's old mare, Pepper, alongside Henry on his large bay stallion. The night was cold, and she was grateful for the heavy coat she'd thrown on over her hastily donned dress. Sheriff James Miller was not pleased to be roused in the middle of the night, but his demeanor changed quickly when he recognized the outlaws. "The Collins gang," he said, rubbing his graying beard as his deputies took charge of the prisoners. "Been after these 3 for months, robbed the bank in Gunnison, killed 2 men during a holdup in our array." "They mentioned something about gold," Lillian said. "They thought my father had gold hidden somewhere," the sheriff snorted. "George Cole was a good man, but he never had 2 coins to rub together that I knew of. These fools must have gotten some bad information, or they were desperate enough to chase any rumor," Henry added. "Well, Miss Cole, seems you're owed a reward," Sheriff Miller said. "There's bounty money on these 3. I'll send word to the federal marshal, but it'll take time for the paperwork to go through." Lillian shook her head. "The reward should go to Mr. Frost. He's the one who saved me." Henry started to protest, but the sheriff cut him off. "How about we split it between you? That seems fair, considering you both had a hand in bringing them in." He looked at Henry. "You planning to stay in Montrose long?" "Just passing through," Henry repeated, though his eyes flickered briefly to Lillian. "Might be a few weeks before that bounty money comes through," the sheriff mused. "If you're looking for work in the meantime, the Winters Ranch outside of town is hiring hands. Owners getting on in years could use some help with his cattle." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I'll look into it. Thank you, Sheriff." As they stepped out of the jailhouse, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Lillian felt the weight of the night's events pressing down on her, exhaustion making her steps heavy. "I should get you home," Henry said, noticing her fatigue. "You need rest after all this." "I'm not sure I'll be able to sleep there," Lillian admitted. "Not after." She trailed off, the image of the intruders in her home still fresh and frightening. Henry studied her face for a moment. "I understand. Is there someone in town you could stay with for a few days?" Lillian shook her head. "I have acquaintances, but no close friends here. My father and I moved to Montrose only a year before he died. We kept mostly to ourselves." A sympathetic look crossed Henry's face. "I could camp near your cabin for a few days if that would help you feel safer. No obligation, of course." The offer surprised her, as did the rush of relief she felt at the prospect. "That's very kind, but I couldn't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask, I offered." His voice was gentle but firm. "Besides, if I'm going to check on that ranch job, I'll need a place to base myself anyway." Lillian hesitated, weighing propriety against fear. In the end, practicality won out. "All right," she agreed. "But not in a camp. I have a small barn. It's not much, but it's shelter, and there's clean hay in the loft." "Sounds like luxury compared to what I'm used to," Henry said with a small smile. "Lead the way, Miss Cole." "Lillian," she corrected him, returning his smile. "If you're going to be my temporary neighbor, you might as well use my name." The ride back to her cabin was easier than the journey into town had been. As the sun rose, painting the mountain peaks with golden light, Lillian found herself studying her companion. Henry Frost rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. His clothes were worn but clean, his gear well maintained despite obvious years of use. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way that some of the young men in town were, but there was something compelling about his weathered features and direct gaze. "Have you been on the move long?" she asked as they followed the narrow trail that led to her property. "About 5 years now," Henry replied, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit. "Before that, I worked my family's farm in Kansas until the drought took it. Been working ranches across the territory since then, never staying in one place too long." "No place felt like home?" Lillian asked. A shadow crossed his face. "Home is a complicated notion when you've lost the one you had," Lillian nodded, understanding all too well. "Yes, it is." They crested a small rise, and her cabin came into view below them. In the morning light, it looked smaller and more vulnerable than she remembered, its weathered logs and simple porch a stark reminder of how alone she'd been. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's more than most have," Henry replied. "You've kept it up well." His simple observation warmed her unexpectedly. "My father built it. I've tried to maintain it the way he would have wanted." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. Upon reaching the cabin, Henry insisted on going inside first to make sure everything was secure. Lillian waited on the porch, steeling herself for the sight of her violated home. When Henry emerged, his expression was reassuring. "I've straightened up a bit. There's some blood on the floor that'll need scrubbing, but otherwise, no lasting damage." Lillian nodded gratefully and followed him inside. True to his word, he'd righted the furniture and picked up the scattered items. The bloodstains were concerning, but not as bad as she'd feared. Still, the memory of the intruders was palpable in the small space. "Let me show you to the barn," she said, not wanting to linger. "And then perhaps, if you're hungry, I could make us some breakfast. It's the least I can do after everything." "I won't say no to a home-cooked meal," Henry admitted. "But only if you'll let me help with the cleanup afterward. Seems like you've had enough to handle on your own." There was something in his tone, not pity, but a genuine understanding that touched Lillian deeply. "It's a deal," she said, and led the way to the barn. The small structure was sturdy, with a stall for Pepper and a hayloft that was clean and spacious enough for a man to sleep comfortably. Henry seemed genuinely pleased with the arrangement, setting his saddlebags down with a satisfied nod. "This will do nicely," he said. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Thank you for saving my life," Lillian countered. "I'll call you when breakfast is ready." Back in her cabin, Lillian moved automatically through the familiar motions of preparing a meal. She stoked the fire in the cook stove, mixed biscuit dough, sliced bacon, and set coffee to boil. The routine tasks helped steady her nerves, though she couldn't help glancing repeatedly at the door, half expecting it to burst open again. When Henry knocked a short while later, she nearly jumped out of her skin. "Sorry," he said when she opened the door, genuine regret in his eyes. "Didn't mean to startle you." "It's all right," Lillian assured him, stepping back to let him in. "I'm just a bit on edge still." "That's natural," Henry said, removing his hat as he entered. "Takes time to feel safe again after something like that." The simple acknowledgement of her fear without judgment or dismissal made Lillian feel understood in a way she hadn't since her father died. "Breakfast is nearly ready," she said, turning to hide the sudden emotion in her eyes. They ate at her small table, the home-cooked food a welcome comfort after the night's trauma. Henry ate with appreciation but not desperation, leading Lillian to believe he hadn't been completely joking about his poor cooking skills. "This is wonderful," he said, accepting a second biscuit. "Been a long time since I've had a meal this good." "It's nothing special," Lillian demurred, though pleased by his compliment. "Just simple food." "Sometimes simple is exactly what's needed," Henry replied. As they ate, Lillian found herself telling him about her life, how her father had moved them from town to town across the Western Territories, working as a farrier and ranch hand, before settling in Montrose when his health began to fail. She told him about learning to manage on her own after his death, how some in town had expected her to sell the cabin and move back east to find a husband, as was proper for a young woman. "But this is my home," she finished. "The only real one I've ever known. I couldn't bear to leave it, even if staying meant struggling." Henry listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly letting her talk. When she finally fell silent, he nodded thoughtfully. "Takes courage to stand your ground like that," he said. "Most people would have taken the easier path." "What about you?" Lillian asked. "You mentioned losing your family farm, but not your family." A flicker of pain crossed Henry's features. "My parents died within months of each other after we lost the farm. My father from a broken heart, folks said, though it was pneumonia that took him in the end. My mother followed soon after. I had no siblings, no reason to stay in a place that held nothing but memories." "I'm sorry," Lillian said softly. Henry shrugged, though the casualness of the gesture didn't match the shadow in his eyes. "It was a long time ago. 5 years changes a person." "Does it?" Lillian asked. "Or does it just give them time to build walls around the pain?" Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the connection between them felt almost tangible, two souls who understood loss in a way that many others didn't. Then Henry looked away, clearing his throat. "I should head over to the Winters Ranch," he said. "See about that work." "Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" Lillian nodded, though the thought of being alone in the cabin still unsettled her. "Of course, I have chores to do anyway, and that blood stain won't clean itself." "I'll be back before dusk," Henry promised. "And I'll bring provisions for my stay so I'm not eating you out of house and home." "You're welcome to share my meals," Lillian offered. "I always cook too much anyway, habit from when my father was alive." Henry hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but I'll contribute what I can." "No sense in you bearing all the burden." After he left, Lillian set to scrubbing the bloodstains from her floor, fighting back the images of the previous night. The physical labor helped distract her, and by midday the cabin was clean again, though she knew it would be some time before it felt completely safe. She spent the afternoon tending her small garden and caring for the few chickens she kept. The routine tasks were soothing, and she found her thoughts drifting often to Henry Frost. There was something reassuring about his presence, not just the protection he offered, but the quiet understanding in his eyes. It had been a long time since Lillian had felt truly seen by another person. As promised, Henry returned before sunset, riding up the path with a canvas bag tied to his saddle. "I got the job," he announced as he dismounted. "Mr. Winters is a fair man, offered decent wages, says I can start tomorrow." "That's wonderful," Lillian said, genuinely pleased for him. "The Winters family has a good reputation in Montrose." "It'll do for a while," Henry agreed. He untied the bag from his saddle. "Got some supplies in town, coffee, flour, salt pork. Figure I should contribute to the meals if you're kind enough to cook them." "Thank you," Lillian said, touched by the gesture. "Would you like to stay for supper? It's nearly ready." Henry smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "I'd like that very much." Over the next few days, they fell into an unexpected routine. Henry would leave at dawn for the Winters ranch, returning in the late afternoon. Lillian would have supper waiting and they would eat together, sharing stories of their days. After the meal, Henry would help with whatever chores needed doing around the property before retiring to the barn for the night. It was a simple arrangement, practical and mutually beneficial. Yet Lillian found herself looking forward to their evening meals with increasing anticipation. Henry was unlike any man she'd known, thoughtful and direct, capable of comfortable silence, but also of surprising insight when he did speak. He treated her with respect that never felt condescending, appreciating her independence rather than questioning it as so many others had. A week after the attack, Lillian was gathering eggs from her chicken coop when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Her heart raced until she recognized Sheriff Miller riding alongside another man in a smart black coat. "Miss Cole," the sheriff called as he dismounted. "Hope we're not intruding. This here is Marshal Davis from Denver. He's come about those outlaws you and Frost helped capture." Lillian wiped her hands on her apron and approached the men. "Marshal, Sheriff, what can I do for you?" The marshal, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache, tipped his hat to her. "Miss Cole, I've come to personally thank you for your assistance in capturing the Collins gang. They've been terrorizing communities across 3 territories for months." "It was mostly Mr. Frost who stopped them," Lillian said modestly. "I was merely defending my home." "From what the sheriff tells me, you showed considerable courage," the marshal countered. "In any case, I've brought the reward money. $500, to be split between you and Mr. Frost, as the sheriff suggested." Lillian's eyes widened at the amount. It was more money than she'd seen at one time in her entire life, enough to make significant improvements to her property, perhaps even expand her garden and buy more chickens to sell eggs in town. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, accepting the envelope he handed her. "This is very generous." "It's what was promised on the wanted posters," the marshal said. "Is Mr. Frost around? I'd like to thank him as well." "He's working at the Winters ranch," Lillian explained. "He should be back in a few hours if you'd care to wait, or I can make sure he receives his share." The marshal checked his pocket watch. "I'm afraid I need to catch the afternoon stage back to Denver. Would you be so kind as to pass along both my thanks and his portion of the reward?" "Of course," Lillian agreed. After the lawman departed, Lillian stood holding the envelope, a strange mixture of emotions washing over her. The reward money was a blessing she hadn't expected, but it also marked the resolution of the incident that had brought Henry into her life. With the outlaws dealt with and the reward distributed, there was no practical reason for him to continue staying in her barn. The thought troubled her more than she cared to admit. When Henry returned that evening, dusty and tired from a day of ranch work, Lillian had already divided the reward money into 2 equal portions. She told him about the marshal's visit as they ate the stew she'd prepared. $250, Henry said, staring at the stack of bills she'd placed before him. "That's a small fortune. You earned it," Lillian said firmly. "Those men would have." She couldn't finish the sentence, the memory still too raw. Henry's expression darkened. "Don't think on it," he said gently. "It's over now and you're safe." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, the unspoken question of what happened next hanging in the air. Finally, Lillian gathered her courage. "With the outlaws captured and the reward paid, I suppose you'll be moving on soon." She tried to keep her voice neutral, though the words tasted bitter on her tongue. Henry looked up sharply, his blue eyes searching her face. "Is that what you want?" "I wouldn't want to keep you from your travels," Lillian said carefully, not quite answering his question. Henry set down his spoon, his expression serious. "Lillian, I've been thinking about that. The job at Winters Ranch is steady work. The pay is fair, the conditions decent. I've been moving from place to place for 5 years now, never staying long enough to put down roots. But lately, I've been wondering what I'm looking for out there on the road." Hope flickered in Lillian's chest, but she kept her expression composed. "And what have you concluded?" "That maybe what I've been looking for isn't out there at all," Henry said quietly. "Maybe it's right here in Montrose." Lillian's heart quickened. The town does have its charms, she said, not quite ready to assume he meant something more personal. A small smile touched Henry's lips. It does. But it's not just the town that's made me consider staying. Their eyes met across the table, and this time neither looked away. I've grown accustomed to our suppers together, Henry continued, to seeing your garden when I ride up in the evenings, to our conversations. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. I know it's been a short time and perhaps it's presumptuous of me, but I've come to care for you, Lillian. The simple declaration sent warmth spreading through her. It doesn't feel presumptuous, she said softly. Not when I've come to feel the same. Relief and joy transformed Henry's weathered face. Then, if you're amenable, I'd like to court you properly. I know I don't have much to offer beyond hard work and honest intentions, but those are worth more than gold to me, Lillian interrupted, reaching across the table to touch his hand. And yes, I would be very amenable to being courted by you, Henry Frost. His fingers curled around hers, rough and calloused but infinitely gentle. I should still find other accommodations in town, he said. For propriety's sake, now that the immediate danger has passed. Lillian nodded reluctantly, knowing he was right. The boarding house on Pine Street is clean and reasonable, she suggested, and not too far from here. I'll inquire tomorrow, Henry promised. Then, with a hint of mischief in his eyes, he added, but I hope I'll still be welcome for supper now and then. Every evening, if you wish, Lillian replied, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As spring turned to summer in the Colorado Territory, Henry and Lillian's courtship blossomed under the watchful eyes of Montrose's residents. They were an unlikely pair by some standards, the independent young woman who lived alone on the edge of town, and the quiet drifter who decided to put down roots. But those who took the time to observe them together saw the genuine affection that had grown between them. Henry proved to be a devoted suitor, calling on Lillian whenever his work at the Winters Ranch permitted. He brought small gifts, wildflowers gathered from the meadows, a carved wooden bird he'd made during evening hours at the boarding house, fresh honeycomb from the hives at the ranch. More precious than these tokens, however, was the time they spent together. They worked side by side expanding Lillian's garden, Henry's strong arms making quick work of turning the soil while Lillian planted the seeds that would provide food for the coming winter. They rode together on Sundays, exploring the beautiful country around Montrose, finding favorite spots by streams and in mountain meadows where they would share simple picnics and talks that lasted for hours. Through these conversations, they discovered the ways their different paths had shaped them into people who understood each other deeply. Henry learned about Lillian's childhood of constant movement, her father's determination to find a place where they could settle, and her own resilience in facing the skepticism of those who believed a woman couldn't make it on her own. Lillian came to understand the profound sense of failure Henry had felt when the drought took his family farm, the restlessness that had driven him from place to place, and the loneliness he'd carried with him on the road. I think I was running, Henry admitted one afternoon as they sat beside a clear mountain stream, their horses grazing nearby. Not toward anything, but away from the memory of watching everything my family had built crumble to dust. Lillian leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. And now, are you still running? Henry's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. No, for the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The kiss they shared then was tender and unhurried, a promise of deeper feelings that grew stronger with each passing day. By midsummer, their courtship had become the subject of approving nods from the matrons of Montrose, who had initially viewed their relationship with skepticism. Mrs. Winters, the ranch owner's wife, took a particular interest in their romance, often sending Henry home with fresh baked pies or preserves for that sweet Cole girl. She's convinced you need fattening up, Henry teased one evening as he presented Lillian with a jar of strawberry preserves. Lillian laughed, taking the jar. She's not wrong. Winter is hard up here and I could use some extra padding. You look perfect exactly as you are, Henry said, his voice dropping to that low tone that never failed to send a pleasant shiver through her. Their kisses had grown more passionate as summer progressed, and both recognized the need to move their relationship forward or risk impropriety. It was during the town's Independence Day celebration that Henry finally spoke of marriage. They had spent the day enjoying the festivities in Montrose's small town square, watching children's races, participating in the communal picnic, and listening to the brass band that had traveled from Denver for the occasion. As dusk fell and the townsfolk gathered for the fireworks display, Henry led Lillian away from the crowd to a quiet spot beneath an old cottonwood tree. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. Lillian watched curiously as he withdrew a small velvet pouch. "Henry." He tipped the contents into his palm, a simple gold ring set with a small but brilliant diamond. "It was my mother's," he explained. "The one thing of value I kept when I sold everything else. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Lillian's breath caught as he dropped to one knee before her, the ring held between his fingers. "Lillian Cole, you've made me remember what it means to have a home, not just a place, but someone to share it with. I love you more than I thought possible, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life by your side. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Lillian's vision as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit as though it had been made for her. When he rose to his feet, she threw her arms around his neck, kissing him with all the love and joy she felt. In the distance, the first fireworks exploded over Montrose, but neither noticed, lost as they were in their own private celebration. They were married in early September, when the aspen trees had just begun to turn gold against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. The ceremony was small but warm, held in Montrose's modest church with the Winters family, Sheriff Miller, and a handful of townspeople in attendance. Lillian wore a new dress of pale blue silk, her one extravagance, purchased with some of her reward money. Henry, in a new black suit that made his blue eyes even more striking, watched her walk down the aisle with such naked adoration that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes. The reception was held at the Winters Ranch, a generous gesture from the couple who had come to think of Henry as the son they'd never had. Tables laden with food were set up in the yard, lanterns were strung from trees, and a local fiddler provided music for dancing that continued well into the evening. "Mrs. Frost," Henry murmured as they swayed together beneath the stars, one hand resting respectfully at her waist. "I'm still not convinced this isn't a dream." Lillian smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "If it is, I don't ever want to wake up." Later, when they were finally alone in the cabin that would now be their home together, all the nervous anticipation Lillian had felt throughout the day transformed into something deeper and more powerful. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he helped her remove the pins from her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, his fingers threading gently through the auburn strands. "I still can't believe you're mine." "As you are mine," Lillian replied, reaching up to trace the strong line of his jaw. Their first night together as husband and wife was everything Lillian had hoped for, tender and passionate, filled with discoveries and whispered words of love. In Henry's arms, she found a completion she hadn't known she was missing, and when they finally drifted to sleep in the pre-dawn hours, it was with the certainty that they had found in each other the home they had both been seeking. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Henry continued working at the Winters Ranch while helping Lillian expand her chicken business. They used some of their reward money to build a larger coop and purchase more hens, allowing Lillian to sell eggs not just to neighbors but to the general store in town. The additional income, combined with Henry's wages, allowed them to make improvements to the cabin, adding a second bedroom and a larger kitchen. Winter came early that year, blanketing Montrose in deep snow by mid-November. The cold months were a time of cozy evenings by the fire, long conversations, and the sweet discovery that Lillian was expecting their first child. "A baby," Henry breathed when she told him, his hand moving reverently to rest on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The wonder in his eyes brought tears to Lillian's. "Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to describe it, Henry said, gathering her in his arms. I love you so much, Lillian, both of you. As spring returned to the mountains and Lillian's body changed with the growing life inside her, they began making plans for their future. The opportunity came unexpectedly when Mr. Winters announced his intention to sell part of his ranch. My sons aren't interested in ranching, the older man explained to Henry one evening when he'd invited the Frosts to dinner. They've both gone to Denver to seek their fortunes in business. Sarah and I are getting too old to manage all this land, but we don't want to leave Montrose entirely. What are you thinking of doing? Henry asked. Selling off the north section about 100 acres, including that stretch along Crawford Creek. Keep enough to run a smaller operation that won't break our backs. Mr. Winters looked at Henry meaningfully. Thought you might be interested in buying it. You've got a good head for ranching, and with a little one on the way, you might be looking to build something more substantial than what you've got now. Henry glanced at Lillian, who nodded slightly. They had discussed this possibility already, having saved most of Henry's wages and the remainder of their reward money with an eye toward eventual expansion. I'd be very interested, Henry said, though I'm not sure we can afford 100 acres outright. Mr. Winters waved a hand dismissively. I'm not looking to get rich off this sale, son. I'd rather see that land go to someone who'll work it properly. We can arrange terms that'll work for both of us. 2 months later, the deal was complete. The Frosts were now the owners of 100 acres of prime Colorado ranchland, with a small creek running through it and enough good grazing to support a modest herd of cattle. The property adjoined their existing homestead, making it a perfect extension of what they already had. Our own ranch, Lillian said wonderingly as they stood on a rise overlooking their new land. She was 7 months pregnant now, her belly a proud curve beneath her loosened dress. When I think about how close I came to losing everything that night the Outlaws came. Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. Let's not dwell on what might have been, look forward instead. He gestured toward the valley below them. That's where we'll build the main house, I think, close to the creek, sheltered from the wind by those cottonwoods. The barn can go just beyond and corrals here for breaking the horses. Lillian leaned into his solid strength, feeling their child move within her. It sounds perfect. It won't be easy, Henry cautioned. Building a ranch from scratch takes years of hard work. Nothing worthwhile comes easily, Lillian replied, but we'll do it together, and that makes all the difference. They began work on their new home immediately, with Henry dividing his time between the Winters ranch and their own property. Friends from town and neighboring farms came to help with the barn raising, and by the time August arrived, the frame of their new house was taking shape on the site they'd chosen. It was there, among the half-finished walls of what would become their family home, that Lillian's labor began. Henry had been nailing siding to the eastern wall when he heard her sharp intake of breath. Lillian, he called, turning to see her clutching her rounded belly, her face pale. The baby, she gasped. It's coming. Henry's heart raced with both excitement and fear. They had planned for the birth to take place in town where the midwife could attend Lillian properly, but the baby, it seemed, had other ideas. Can you ride? Henry asked, already moving toward her. Lillian shook her head as another contraction gripped her. No, there's no time. It's happening too fast. Henry made a swift decision. I'll take you to the cabin. It's closer than town. He helped her into their wagon and drove as carefully as he could over the rough terrain, wincing at every jolt that made Lillian gasp. By the time they reached the cabin, her contractions were coming fast and strong. I need to get the midwife, Henry said after settling Lillian on their bed. There's no time, Lillian insisted, gripping his hand with surprising strength. This baby is coming now, Henry. You'll have to help me. The fear Henry felt in that moment was unlike anything he'd experienced before, greater even than facing down the outlaws who'd threatened Lillian's life. But the trust in her eyes steadied him, and he nodded. Tell me what to do. The next hours were a blur of pain and determination. Lillian, despite her suffering, maintained a remarkable clarity, guiding Henry through the process with instructions she remembered from assisting at other women's births. Henry worked through his fear, following her directions and offering what comfort he could. As twilight painted the sky outside their window, Lillian gave a final, powerful push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to both his parents' eyes. "A boy," Henry said in wonder, cradling the tiny, red-faced infant after cleaning him as Lillian had instructed. "We have a son, Lillian." "Let me see him," Lillian whispered, exhausted but radiant. Henry placed their son in her arms, then sat beside them on the bed, one arm around his wife's shoulders as they both marveled at the perfect little being they had created. "He has your eyes," Lillian said, tracing a gentle finger over the baby's flushed cheek. "And your strength," Henry replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "What shall we call him?" Lillian studied their son's face for a moment. "George, after my father," she suggested. "George Henry Frost." "It's a good name," Henry agreed. "A strong name for a boy who's going to grow up on a ranch his parents built from nothing." Lillian looked up at her husband, love filling her heart to overflowing. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For hearing my scream that night and coming to help." "For staying, for loving me, for giving me a family again." Henry gathered his wife and son closer, overcome with gratitude for the life he'd found when he least expected it. "You gave me those same gifts," he said. "A home, a purpose, love, everything that matters." Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, witnessing the beginning of a family that had been forged in danger but would grow in love, putting down roots as deep and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. 5 years passed, years of hard work and joy as the Frost Ranch took shape and their family grew. George was joined by a sister, Emma, when he was 3, and the sound of children's laughter became as much a part of their lives as the changing seasons. The ranch prospered under Henry's careful management and Lillian's practical support. They began with a small herd of cattle purchased from Mr. Winters, gradually expanding as their profits allowed. The new house was completed by the time Emma was born, a sturdy 2-story structure with room for their growing family and the occasional visitor. Lillian's chicken business had grown as well, with her eggs now considered the finest in Montrose. She'd added a vegetable garden that produced enough to sell the excess in town, and she'd learned to make cheese from the milk of the 2 cows Henry had bought her as an anniversary present. On a warm autumn day in 1881, 5 years after their wedding, the Frosts hosted a celebration at their ranch. It wasn't a formal occasion, but rather a gathering of friends to mark the completion of their new barn and to give thanks for the community that had supported them. Tables were set up in the yard between the house and the barn, laden with food prepared by Lillian and the neighboring women. Children ran playing among the adults, their shrieks of delight adding to the festive atmosphere. Henry stood watching it all, a mug of cider in his hand and contentment warming his chest. "Penny for your thoughts," Lillian said, coming to stand beside him. At 27, she had matured into her beauty, the girlish softness replaced by the confident grace of a woman who knew her own strength. Her auburn hair was piled atop her head, with a few strands escaping to frame her face in the way that never failed to make Henry's heart skip. "Just thinking how lucky I am," Henry replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "Look at all we've built, Lil." Together they surveyed the scene, their handsome house with its wide porch, the new barn with its fresh red paint, the corral where several fine horses grazed, the distant fields where their cattle roamed. But more than the physical structures, it was the life they'd created that filled Henry with pride. Their children, healthy and happy, the respect they'd earned in the community, the love that had only deepened between them with each passing year. "We've been blessed," Lillian agreed, leaning into his side. "Though I think we worked for most of it," Henry chuckled. "That we did." "Papa, Papa," 5-year-old George came running toward them, his dark hair so like Henry's flopping over his forehead. "Sheriff Miller says he wants to buy one of our colts for his deputy." "Does he now?" Henry ruffled his son's hair. "Well, tell him I'll speak with him about it after we eat." George nodded seriously and ran back to deliver the message, his importance in the task evident in his straight-backed stride. "He's so much like you," Lillian said fondly. "Same serious expression when he's given a responsibility." "Heaven help us if Emma takes after you," Henry teased. "One stubborn Cole woman in the family is quite enough." Lillian elbowed him playfully. I believe I'm a stubborn Frost woman now, thank you very much. Their banter was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Winters, who insisted they come try the apple pie she'd brought. As the day progressed and their friends enjoyed the hospitality of the Frost Ranch, Lillian found herself drawn to the newly built porch swing. She sat watching the celebration, a sleeping Emma cradled in her arms. The 2-year-old had played until exhaustion overtook her, and now slumbered peacefully against her mother's chest, one chubby hand curled around a lock of Lillian's hair. Sheriff Miller joined her on the swing, his weathered face creased in a smile. Fine gathering you and Henry have put together, Mrs. Frost. Thank you, Sheriff. We're glad you could come. The sheriff nodded, his gaze moving over the assembled guests. You know, I remember the night I first saw you two together, standing in my jailhouse covered in dust and blood, looking like you'd been through hell itself. Never would have guessed then that I'd be sitting here 5 years later, watching you host half the county at your ranch. Lillian smiled at the memory. Life takes unexpected turns. That it does. The sheriff's expression grew more serious. Got news today that might interest you. Jackson Collins died in prison last week. Lillian stilled. Jackson Collins had been the leader of the outlaw gang that had broken into her cabin that fateful night, the only one of the 3 who had survived to stand trial. I see. Thought you should know, the sheriff continued. Closes that chapter for good, I reckon. Lillian nodded, unconsciously holding Emma a little tighter. Thank you for telling me. The sheriff patted her hand gently. You built something fine here, you and Henry. Don't let the shadows of the past dim the brightness of what you have now. I won't, Lillian promised, and found that she meant it. The memory of that terrifying night had faded over the years, replaced by countless happy moments with the family she and Henry had created. As the sheriff moved away to join another conversation, Henry approached the porch, carrying a sleepy George on his hip. The boy's head rested on his father's shoulder, his eyes half closed despite his determination to stay awake for the entire celebration. Room for 2 more. Henry asked, nodding toward the swing. Lillian shifted Emma to make space. Always. Henry settled beside her, arranging George on his lap. The boy snuggled against his chest with a contented sigh, finally surrendering to sleep. Sheriff Miller told me about Collins, Henry said quietly. Lillian nodded. It feels strange knowing he's gone, like the last thread connecting us to that night has been cut. Are you all right? Lillian considered the question, looking at her sleeping children, her strong and gentle husband, the home they'd built together. Yes, she said finally. More than all right, I'm grateful. If those men hadn't broken in that night, if you hadn't heard my scream and come running. I think we would have found each other anyway, Henry said with quiet certainty. Some things are meant to be, Lil. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the familiar comfort of his presence. I hope you're right. I can't imagine a life without you in it. You'll never have to, Henry promised, pressing a kiss to her hair. As twilight deepened into evening, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the continuing celebration. From where they sat on the porch swing, the Frosts could see it, all their friends and neighbors laughing and talking, the ranch they'd built through years of hard work, the future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Colorado sky. I love you, Henry Frost, Lillian said softly. Henry's arm tightened around her shoulders. And I love you, Lillian Frost, more with each passing day. The gentle rocking of the swing lulled their sleeping children deeper into dreams, while their parents sat in companionable silence, watching the stars appear one by one above their home, the home that had begun with danger and a scream in the night, but had become a haven of love and hope for all the days to come. Years later, long after Henry and Lillian had passed on, the Frost Ranch would still stand in the valley outside Montrose. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story of how it all began with 3 outlaws, a brave young woman, and a cowboy who heard her scream and came running. But more than the drama of that first meeting, they would remember the love that had built something enduring from those dangerous beginnings, a love as solid as the mountains and as constant as the changing seasons, a legacy that would continue for generations to come.